Good morning and welcome to Kyazma's weekly Ask the Admin training on August 22nd, 2014. My name is Morgan Roberts and I'll be your trainer today. I'm a certified Salesforce.com advanced admin developer and Sales Cloud consultant. I've been working with the company for almost 3 years now and have done many and varied deployments throughout my time here. So today, my hope is that we can go over some of the different methods of deploying changes throughout your organizations, or Salesforce organizations. I also hope to be able to help you avoid some of the pitfalls that I've run into and find some of the tips and tricks that help us to be as quick and as efficient as we can. Now, in Salesforce, as we know, everything's hosted on Salesforce, and so we have to find ways to modify and change and make adjustments to our different organizations. Moving things from Sandbox to production, production back to Sandbox, installing packages from the App Exchange. Perhaps you have a Salesforce partner, such as Kyazma, and we build something in a development org. We can install that as a package. But the question is really, what are some of the best practices that we have when we want to move between orgs? And as we, how do we make this as clean as possible? So the first question that we need to have answered is, what changes do we make where? When is it appropriate to use a sandbox? When is it appropriate to use an external development org? When does it make sense to just go ahead and make the changes in production? Now, everyone's going to tell you something just a little bit different, but from my experience, I've found that when I'm making, I've found it easiest to make new custom objects, custom fields, etc. in a production environment. These types of changes, adding fields, adding objects, are not things that are world-breaking. You can keep them separate so that they are not accessible to your users until you're ready for them to have access to them. And that way we can control the permissions for a production org right in the situation and can avoid some of the hassles of moving permissions between orgs. Now, if you're making changes to fields, such as converting a type, or working within enabling new functionality and testing it out, such as enabling person accounts or other changes that are both, number one, global, and number two, may or may not be irreversible in your org. Those make sense to test out in a sandbox environment first. Now, we inside of a sandbox, as we know, we have to make any changes to Apex coding, test any major functionality, such as major workflow rules. It makes sense to do that in a sandbox environment where your users aren't going to be impacted if you are making those types of changes there. The one exception to that might be the situation where you're doing a brand new implementation. Especially for new implementations, there's likely going to be a lot of things that are going to be added to the org. Custom objects, custom fields, workflow rules. In that case, with those type of configuration items, I tend to build those directly into production on a new install, so that I don't have to manage the permissions over changes. So to recap, production is great for isolated changes and for configuration changes on new installs. If you're changing any existing functionality, or if you're making adjustments to Apex coding, we need to pull that out into a sandbox. Now, there are times when people will say, hey, let's get our own personal dev org. Extracting something out to a development org makes sense when there is a lot of complex functionality, but that it is not dependent on any other item in the org. When you're doing a complete new functionality that perhaps needs to go to multiple locations, or that you really want to prove out and vet, and there's lots of integration points, or your org is large and has a lot of metadata from other projects already, using a dev org is a good option so that you can pare that down and focus on what needs to be accomplished in that new environment, and then transfer that over into your staging and then finally your production org. Now, let's talk about methods of transfer. As everyone is familiar with, we start off with the almighty change set. So in your organization, under the deploy tab, we have 4 items of importance. First are the sandboxes. Second, the deployment connections. Deployment connections work between your orgs that are related. So sandbox to sandbox, sandbox to production. This is important to note that you cannot go from a third-party dev org or a personal developer org that you got from Developer Force into a production environment. That requires a different method. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and make an outbound change set. And on that outbound change set, we'll add any of the information that we need to push up to production. When you're deploying from a development environment, so say you've got a large-scale installation, you've got a very large org, you've siphoned off this project into its own org so you can see it clearly, and you want to put it into your sandbox now for testing before deploying to production. What you're going to do is in your developer org, we're going to come here to create, and we're going to create a package. A package is extremely useful and very similar to a change set. Inside the package, we have our the same attributes that you would upload to a change set. We can come here and we can add any of these items. Make sure not to forget your remote sites for any integration. On your workflow rules, don't forget to include the related workflow field updates or tasks. They also have a handy tool that you can use to view the dependencies and add those as they become necessary, making sure that you don't forget something. Now, the nice thing about a package is that when you update a package, you can simply reinstall the new version, and it matches fields based on API name. So if I install a version 1.0 package and then I go back to my dev org and I make some changes, as I upload a new version, I can go to my sandbox and say, hey, install this package, and it will recognize that it's not the same version and update those components accordingly. Now, let's get to the real meat of it. What are some of the pitfalls that can occur when making these types of transitions? Now, with packages, we have a really nice feature, which is that on install, it asks me who needs access to the components in this particular package. And I can select specific profiles, administrators only, give full access to everyone, and manage those permissions as those components are coming in. When I'm making a change set, however, the same is not true. So let's go here to our sandbox org, and we're going to set up our deployment connection, make sure that those are allowed. Inbound change sets from dev, and here we're going to build our outbound change set. Now, if I've got some specific permissions that I've already set up on this particular org, the things that I need to watch out for is that I don't leave some permissions behind. I can't tell you how many times that I've said, oh, I need to add these two fields to the organization, wrote some code that worked very nicely in Sandbox, deployed it to production, and I get permissions errors. So we're going to have a sample change set here. We add these change set components. We're going to add our Apex classes here. The my class test. Now I can deploy these and that will be just fine. The metadata will arrive there. However, only the system admins will have access to those classes unless you add the profile settings for the included components. This is a feature that came out about a year ago. It matches these profile settings based on name. So in this case, I've changed some specific settings on the standard user and on the customer portal user, for example. I need them to have access to these Apex classes. And then with those added, I can go ahead and upload this change set, deploy it to production, and those changes will come across with it, including the profile settings. Profile settings include things like field level security, Apex class access, Visualforce page access, custom object permissions, and those are things that if you have to redo them in production, I can tell you you're going to be kicking yourself because it's no fun to have to go back through and re-enable permissions for multiple profiles for these types of items. So it's that simple. Just make sure you include whatever profile settings that you need. Now, the next trick that I'd like to show you is one that I found out about after about a year of doing this type of Salesforce consulting work, and it has really made a few things quite a bit easier. I'm opening up the Force.com IDE. You can use either the Force IDE, you can also use you can also use Sublime and Maven's Mate, which are some additional. There you go. Sublime and Maven's Mate are an open source version of the Force.com IDE. Now we're going to add some metadata components. By default, when doing this, it pulls Apex, Visualforce, static resources, classes, triggers, but we're going to go ahead and add our custom objects to this. So for example, if I'm creating a bunch of fields on the lead that I want to capture, and now I'm going to be moving from a lead, I want to map those fields from the lead to the account. I can do that quite simply through editing the metadata on the back end and using the Force.com IDE in order to push those changes. We'll wait for that to complete. Here we go. And we've got in objects this my object. Go ahead and open that up. Let's view the source. You can see all of the metadata in Salesforce is represented as XML files. We come down here, we can add a new tag called fields. Let's see. Did not pull. Let's see. I had one set up earlier. Let me make sure that those got added. Oh, it didn't add the standard objects. That's why. There we go. And re-pull that. Awesome. We'll go to the account object. Here at the bottom, you can see all of these fields tags. These define all of the custom fields that you have inside of Salesforce. Now this one here is a custom field that I added called region. If I wanted to quickly make several fields, perhaps a region, sub-region, and district, for example. I can come in here, quickly edit this information, change the label, save that, and I can deploy this using the Force IDE, save to server, and it will create those fields and push them up to my production org. What error did we receive? It doesn't like the dash. There we go. And push that up. Good, went through successfully. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our production org. Customize accounts fields. And here you'll see we have all of our custom objects created. This is a great way if you have 20, 30, 40 plus fields that you need to migrate between objects. I can take those same definitions that I had here for my region, subregion, region, subregion, and I can copy those to, for example, a lead object. Now, just a note, unfortunately, you cannot delete fields in this manner. Deleting a field requires something called a destructive XML file, which we will cover in just a moment. And the last one was district. All of the pick list values there. Go ahead and save that one. The other thing that you can do in here that is quite nice is removing some of these pick list values. So for example, industry, it comes with quite a number. Let's say I just want to clear that list out. I can go ahead and remove those items. So all that should be left is the pick list value. And now I'm going to go ahead and save all of those files up to the server. Good. Those have been completed. Now let's go take a look at our production org. So here, if we're going to refresh, we'll take a look at that industry. You'll notice we only have the one pick list value. On leads, we've successfully transferred all of the custom fields over. Now we can simply map the lead values and have region go to region, subregion to subregion, and district to district. Go ahead and save that. Oop, wrong one. There we go. Awesome. It's that easy.